September 21st, 1972 was the day martial law was established in the Philippines. On that day, all media outlets were shut down and one man appeared on national television. That figure was Ferdinand Marcos, who had just proclaimed and introduced martial law, being that the head of the military, being himself, would also assume the head position of power over the entire nation, thus enveloping what is known to be one of the most tragic and unheroic episodes in Filipino history. With this proclamation, Marcos legally and officially solidified himself as the sole dominant figure of authority with absolute power over all legal, political, and social constituents. This movement towards a seemingly dictatorship regime left the majority of the public population in a state of civil unrest. Being subjected to a government where military focus and stability was the pivotal concern, as exemplified by Marcos's alleged assassination of a political opponent of his father's, where he used his implementation of martial law to protect his reputation and influential power. This self-centeredness rendered the Filipino people without a voice, without an active say in the future of their country, and with an oppressed sense of national identity. Additionally, under the martial law, Marcos disregarded the Constitution. For instance, he violated the provision which guaranteed the Bill of Rights. Upon his orders, the military picked up and detained thousands of Filipinos suspected of political subversion, and among these were his critics and political opponents. Ultimately, Marcos was an abusive leader. He manipulated the faith and support of the population by pledging he would restore and ensure economic and national prosperity, but instead only wanted to use the power for his own individual benefit. People believed and abided by martial law for a short period of time, only to then realize how materialistic and damaging their leader was. This led to the construction of an authoritarian insurgency where the Filipino people fought back at militant political agenda that dominated the nation. These people, known as NPAs, waged a vigorous war against government forces, engaged in terrorist activity, and acted to assassinate several political officials, all to signify and express their strong disagreements with Marcos's reign. They acted purely in the hope to ignite significant change and send a message that they were being deprived of their basic individual, communal, and national freedoms, along with their ability to contribute anything at all besides their service to the Philippines. As a result of this act of rebellion, Marcos increased his level of armed forces to that of over 300,000 soldiers, to provide a resistance to the threat that aimed to tear down the authority that he had worked unjustifiably to maintain. He instructed his soldiers to do whatever was necessary in order to strike down any person that stood to combat or oppose his control, thus emphasizing his tendency to too easily resort to hard power to solve his problems. Ultimately, this epitomized the fact that he was a shrewd leader who ruled out of the manipulation of democratic ideals. His inability to differentiate between physical force and a conscious sense of morality was effectively the driving force behind his downfall as a leader, which led to such a corrupt and defiant Philippines.
Marcos declared martial law, citing rising civil disobedience as justification. Throughout this decree, Marcos seized emergency powers, giving him full control of the Philippine military and the authority to suppress the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and many other civil liberties. Marcos also dissolved the Philippine Congress and shut down media establishments critical of his government. He also ordered the immediate arrest of his political opponents and critics. Benigno Aquino was against Marcos, and very outspoken about it. As he was poised to run for president against Marcos, Marcos declared martial law and put Aquino in prison. He was sentenced to death, but was able to escape his sentence by going to the US for surgery. Upon the lifting of martial law a few years later, he returned to the Philippines, but was killed by soldiers almost immediately. When fighting martial law, it is almost never prudent to try and use force in retaliation to the oppressors. In this case especially, it would only give Marcos and his military a reason to kill the protesters and make examples of them without retribution. Had they been using violent acts to fight against the oppression of Marcos, he would have had less opposition if he killed them. Benigno was killed because he was outspoken against Marcos, and Marcos probably wanted to make an example of him. However, his country did not react as Marcos had probably foreseen, and they were giving a rallying point around Benigno, or Ninoy as he was called, and Cory Aquino as she dealt with her husband's death. Because of her popularity among the anti-Marcos group, when Marcos called for a presidential election in 1986, Cory Aquino was run as the opposition. She ended up losing the initial count, but much of the country believed Marcos' win to be fraud. Thousands took to the streets after the White House said that the election was indeed fraud. It was, as George Shultz, Secretary of State at the time, called it, an overwhelming human presence, a living, breathing river of humanity moving through the capital. Almost simultaneously, Marcos' support crumbled around him. Without a strong military to back him against the protesters, Marcos was quickly ousted from power. With Marcos, the use of nonviolent action was clearly successful in changing the Philippines into a just country. While it also took some influence from outside countries, mainly the US, there was no violence used or threat of violence used to rid Marcos from power. Had there been violent actions even threatened against Marcos, he could have responded with harsh acts against his citizens, even just in response to a US threat.
The lack of violence gave him no way to act against a steady opposition, and this lack of action by Marcos allowed his opposition to grow and grow, until there was no way for him, or the rest of the world, to ignore the masses. It became so blatantly obvious that the country wanted him gone, and they were able to oust him as a result. Nonviolent action had once again proven to be successful against an oppressive regime. Had the opposition in the Philippines gone about fighting Marcos in any other way, they most likely would have been crushed. He loved his power and was willing to do whatever it took to keep it. However, once his support crumbled, he had no way to keep his power in the face of the masses, and the nonviolent protests ended up succeeding. Marcos' controversial government was quickly changed by Cory Aquino into a true democracy, like the one that existed in the Philippines before Marcos.
The country realized their need for democracy when Aquino was assassinated. An investigation into the assassination was put together by Marcos, the results of which implicated General Fabian Ver. General Ver was a top military officer and also Marcos' cousin. General Ver stepped down from his spot as Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, where he commanded more than 160,000 troops. But he did not serve any jail time, as Marcos saw the panel that indicted him as having great contradictions of opinion and testimony. Benigno Aquino was a popular candidate of the Laban political party. Their goals were that of freedom, justice, equity, and social responsibility. Aquino opposed Marcos. He read and studied the work of Mahatma Gandhi while in the United States and decided he would deploy the use of nonviolence to overthrow Marcos. His assassination proved the country was in need of a change, as it served as a realization that Marcos held all of the power. He controlled both their system of law and their economy. That being said, the goals and values of nonviolent conflict and civil disobedience are a viable option for changing a perceived unjust society into a just one. As Gandhi once said, "In my humble opinion, non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as is cooperation with good." They needed to use civil disobedience in order to remove Marcos, and in doing so, they proved the power and influence of the oppressed when the oppressed band together. Some of the methods of civil disobedience that they used were public speeches, banners, posters, radio, television, marches, demonstrative funerals, vigils, and non-violent occupation. Police officers had to use tear gas and water cannons on the 20,000 demonstrators at Mendiola Bridge. All of these methods led up to Aquino's wife Corazon running for president with full support of both the United Nationalist Democratic Organization and JAJA, Justice for Aquino, Justice for All. The election results reported by the Filipino Parliament officially declared Marcos to be the winner on February 15th, even though NAMFREL, the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, compiled data that suggested Corazon had won by nearly 800,000 votes. The following day, Corazon held a national rally called the Triumph of the People Rally at Luneta Park, where approximately 1.5 million supporters attended. Corazon called for nationwide civil disobedience. More specifically, she called for the boycotting of every business and establishment in support of Marcos. They did so, and the results went as far as the boycotting of businesses, pro-Marcos media, and banks that had known relationships with Marcos' regime. Schools were shut down, and Filipinos stopped paying their bills altogether. The rally was successful in gaining the support of military officials and other members of Marcos' regime, and ultimately their civil disobedience, along with the help of the United States, forced Marcos to flee the country, allowing Corazon to become the president of the Philippines.